Joining me now is musician Zach Bair, who has a great new song called Black. I was listening to it many times before we started right now. Zach, thank you for coming back on the show. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's give people a little bit of your background. Like, just because we've talked before doesn't mean everybody necessarily caught that episode. Tell us a little bit about yourself. People go to your website, they say musician, entrepreneur, but we can talk about both of those. But obviously, talking about Black, it's the first half of that, the musician side. So, talk a little bit about your background musically.
Absolutely. So appreciate that. And I don't know. I've been playing music for a long time. I started playing piano when I was just a little kid. My mom tried to get me lessons in classical music, but I was more into like pop kind of stuff. And then I discovered the guitar when I got into my teens, and at that point, it was like, okay, yeah, here we go. And I've worked in technology most of my life, and I chose instead to, instead of going down the road of going to LA and, living in a one room with four sweaty guys trying to get a deal, I figured I'd just use my technology expertise and run that parallel with my music career. So got a later start than a lot of folks did. And then when when the pandemic started, I mean, I've been playing professionally, I guess probably for 20 years now, but when the pandemic hit, I went ahead and knocked out an EP that had been on my mind for a while, and that's gotten some good traction. I don't know, I just love music. I play guitar, I write music, I sing, I do play piano and can play the other instruments as well. And just at this point in time, looking to try to get that next hit song.
Sure. And, you're talking about your mom trying to get you to play classical music, but then there you hear off in the distance, popular music. What were some of the things that were, basically like the devil on your shoulder, maybe with like a cool leather jacket and a cigarette saying like, come on over here. What were you tempted by that wasn't classical music?
Well, like Elton John, in terms of
Sure.
piano playing, and Billy Joel, and then in terms of rock music, I guess in the late '70s, I got into Led Zeppelin and Boston, and a bunch of other, Aerosmith and the Eagles, and pretty much all the big classic rock bands. I was into all that stuff. So that devil was absolutely 100% on my shoulder, the whole
Well, if it's
time.
if it's Elton John, the devil was dressed in a Donald Duck costume, or he had a
Exactly.
sequin Dodgers uniform, and
Yep.
yeah, obviously, you know, you talk about the piano playing being sort of the starting point. It's hard to imagine, at least in terms of popular music, two figures that wouldn't be more interesting, obviously, than the piano man himself, Billy Joel, and of course Elton John, who just recently, right before, within the last few weeks before you and I spoke, I guess he's now in the EGOT category because he has an
Yeah.
Emmy for his farewell show at Dodger Stadium, and he already, of course, had many Grammys. He had an Oscar and a Tony, so
Yeah.
good for
Pretty
him.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure
An
they'll
amazing.
they'll have to extend that term EGOT for other awards that he's also won. But yeah, I was this was like in the late '90s, but there was that moment where they did the tour together, Elton John and Billy Joel,
Of
and
course.
that was fantastic. To
The
that was
powerhouse tour.
that might actually be the only time I've seen Elton. I know someone locally here in LA who is a tribute artist. His name's Kenny Metcalf, and he does a Elton the early years touring thing, and I've seen that many times,
Awesome.
and it's great. But in terms of seeing actual Elton, it wasn't until I opened my mouth and as I was saying that sentence, I remembered. I think that was the only time I saw. I've seen Billy Joel many times, but just to watch the two of them, that couldn't be much more fun than that. But then also, you're referencing sort of the big ones like Zeppelin, Aerosmith, and I think
Sure.
it's easy for people to forget that just how great those early Boston records were, and
Phenomenal.
for whatever reason, bands like Boston and REO Speedwagon, Kansas, people
Yep.
tend to, especially the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, will turn their noses up at bands like them and Foreigner. But when you go
Oh,
through
yeah.
like the track listing on those, I grew up listening to a lot of classic rock radio in the early 90s, and it's like, oh, entire playlists were pulled from records from those few bands that don't really get the appreciation that they deserve, I don't think.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to like when I really started thinking that I wanted to get into music, Boston was really the first band that pulled me in that direction. I was kind of dating myself here, but I was in high school in '79, and I was on the journalism team, and Boston was coming to my town, and everybody in the school knew that I was just like crazy over Boston, and my nickname was Boston at the time, and because I love the band, and she came up to me during class one day and said, "Hey, do you want to go interview Boston?" I'm like, "Well, hell yeah, I do. Of course, I want to interview." So that talk about an unforgettable experience. The whole thing was unforgettable because I ended up getting a couple of good tickets that were beside the stage, and I took a little girlfriend with me, and I'd already been had press passes and things like that, but we weren't satisfied with those tickets. But starting in the afternoon, it's very much reminiscent of Jukebox Hero. And, we were literally standing by the backstage door. The door was cracked and I could, peek in, and I was taking pictures of Brad Delp and, the rest of the band, warming up and flash forward to the show, and we kept sneaking over the rail and jumping down into the front. And 2 or 3 times they came down and threw us back up into the stands. And the last time I swore they were going to kick us out. And I remember this like absolute like yesterday. As the lady said, "Hey, do you want to go interview the band?" I'm like, absolutely. So, really a pivotal moment for me was getting to interview Brad Delp and Tom Schultz, back in '79. Sammy Hagar opened for that concert, by the way. And it was just, that was it for me. I was like, okay, I'm going to be a singer. I'm going to learn how to play guitar.
Yeah, it's sort of getting that opportunity to actually, interview them. Did you did you like record the interview, or was it like you were just taking notes from the conversation?
Yeah, no, didn't record it. This is for like our school paper, so I took notes and wrote an article and had a couple of pictures as well.
Yeah, I as much of a fan of music going back I am, I've never really had any kind of ability, unfortunately, as people who have attended karaoke nights with my wife and I would know. But I was always a big fan, but also just a huge fan of comedy and late night. So when I was in college, Conan O'Brien had the Late Night with Conan O'Brien show, was filming a bit at my college. So I asked if I could, ask him some questions. So there's this picture of me in like 1996. He's much taller than I am. I'm holding up like one of those little, handheld tape recorders. So I still have that. And, I wrote about it. I asked him what I thought were funny questions, but then I look at it now and I'm like, oh boy, you were trying too hard. But the point of all of that is you get to meet someone that you're like, oh, that's great. And, I interned on his show when I was later in college. I interned on Saturday Night Live. So getting to be around these things, you're like, wow, this is pretty cool. I was literally just talking about a little while ago, I was recording a conversation about something totally different. And just mentioned in passing that there was a Godzilla movie that came out in 1998, and it had a collaboration from Puff Daddy and Jimmy Page on the soundtrack. It was a version of Kashmir. And then we're talking about it, my friend Zach and I, on a show we just recorded. And I was like, oh yeah, when I was an intern at SNL, they performed live. And I remember I went down and watched the rehearsals, and I was just like, wait, I saw Puff Daddy and Jimmy Page perform live. Probably not a lot of people can say that they did that. And you just kind of forget the opportunity that gets afforded, being in a, TV studios and things like that, but actually being backstage, so you're there and you're probably like, yeah, this is clearly the thing to do, was there like a drive of, I assume you were working hard at music before that, but was it like, oh, and I really got to put the time in, or what was the impact?
I fooled around with it for a while. I ended up joining the Air Force. And then while I was in the Air Force, I guess I kind of got involved in my first, what I call professional band, even though it was probably a terrible group. But, but I got my first taste of playing professionally. I mean, I played in high school band and all that kind of stuff, but and then once I got out and didn't really know what I was going to do, I started getting more serious about it and did some music throughout my years in Shreveport, and then came back to East Texas, went back to school, and then when I went to Houston, and this was the early '90s, that's when it really kind of, I guess, hit me. A buddy of mine took me to a place called Pig and Whistle Pub that I'll never forget, and the place was completely packed, and people were dancing on the bar, and there was a band that were playing that, and it kind of Beatlesque but more rocking. I can't remember the name of the band, but I was like, holy cow, this is unbelievable. And at that point, I was still actually living in East Texas, and I'm like, I'm out of here. So I packed my stuff, and 2 weeks later, I moved to Houston, and 3 months later, I had a band and started playing the circuit. And that's kind of when I started really getting into it.
Yeah, and I've never spent any time in Houston. I visited a friend in Austin once, but my understanding from the way you hear established bands talk about it, that there's at least to some extent there's quite a, even in the present day, there's still a decent enough rock scene in Houston.
Great scene.
People, and a lot of bands make sure to hit Houston when they're. Yeah, I mean, look. You don't need me to tell you how big Texas is. You could do a whole month tour where you're hitting different spots in Texas. I mean, that was the old joke. Like, wherever you are in the state of Texas, you could drive 10 hours in any direction and still be in the state of Texas. So,
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about getting somewhere like that, though. That look, it isn't LA, it isn't New York, it isn't even Nashville. Obviously, that's not to say that there isn't something there, but it's not necessarily where people gravitate towards. What sort of opportunities did you get when you got there? Assuming we're talking about like the early '80s or somewhere in that range, right?
Yeah, late, really early '90s is when I got to Houston. Okay. So by then, we'd already had, Guns N' Roses that just came out a year or two before that and just blew me away with Appetite for Destruction, and all the big rock clubs were really happening in Houston at that point in time. So I put a rock band together. We were playing covers, but I started writing some stuff, and we intermingled original music with our covers, and it got to the point where we were playing 4 nights a week all over Houston for quite a long time, and I still had a day job at the time as well in technology, and it really wasn't until I lived in Houston for like 6 years, and we just pounded the daylights out of the circuit there. I mean, any place that would not throw us out, we basically played it. And then,
and as you proved when you went to the show, the Boston show, even if a place did throw you out, you'd try to sneak in the back door and try and get out there anyway.
100%. Yeah. But I ended up getting a job offer at EDS in Dallas, and I didn't want to leave Houston at the time because I love the town. I still love the town. I consider it my hometown, and ended up going to Dallas. And once I went to Dallas, I knew that I was making like double the money that I was making in Houston. I was like, okay, I'm going to make a record now. So I would commute back and forth to Houston every weekend because the rest of my band was in Houston. And we started recording my first record, which was recorded at Sugar Hill Studios. And it was my freshman effort at making a record, and it came out pretty good. It took about 6 months to record that and put it out, but I didn't know what I was doing back then, and got it out there, got some good reviews on it, and this was right when the unfortunate time that grunge was starting to come into.
Sure.
I say unfortunate, but I mean I like Seattle music as well, but I've always been the very melodic rock kind of guy, and as a consequence, the labels that had been looking at us at the time, started going to the direction of the Nirvanas of the world and things like that. So I was pretty much on my own again at that point in time.
Yeah, we talk a lot. A lot of the musicians I talk to, either from that era or were coming up in that era. There's a lot of conversation sort of about that time. There's always the example you hear about Janie Lane from Warrant went into his record company.
I love Janie Lane.
Where there had been a giant Warrant poster, there was now an Alice in Chains poster, and you just realize like, oh, that's how it's shifting. And talk about guys from that era, and I mention this regularly because I just was really impressed by the way he looked at it. Mark Slaughter, who people know from Slaughter and the
Sure.
Vinnie Vincent Invasion, that was definitely a band that was certainly hit by that moment in time. They have their second album come out in 1992, and already people are starting to move on. And he's like, yeah, look, there's no bad feelings towards those bands, like Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Nirvana. They were all putting out great records. That's not the point. The fact that the record company was like, well, clearly that's all we can do now. It wasn't like some way to, hey, how do we figure out how we can do both? It was just the very abrupt about face. And it's very unfortunate because I'll talk to the guys in Tesla, and they had an album called Bust a Nut come out in 1994. Those guys are great. That album's great, but just came out at the wrong time. Skid Row were like the first hard rock band to debut at #1 on the Billboard charts because they switched over to the SoundScan. It was actually based on sales in 1991, and then by the time their third album comes out, it's like by the late 90s they were like billing themselves as a different band because like they couldn't call themselves Skid Row and have people want to see them. And it's just so quick, and it's almost like I've talked to guys who got into, composing, doing scores for movies and television, just a lot of other musical jobs. But they're like, you could not be like, even producers couldn't be like, oh yeah, I produced this LA Guns album. If they saw that, they were like, oh, we don't want to talk to you. So I can imagine, Zach, having not established yourself at that point, it was, even tougher than having already had, a body of work of like, hey, remember all the songs that they used to play on MTV, now trying to sort of, get people to pay attention.
Well, the way I look at it is, and I think this is true with a lot of bands. I've gotten to know Rob Thomas and Matchbox 20 pretty good because I work with them in my other life. But hearing the stories of how, he wrote 3 a.m., in his former band many, many years ago, it made me feel a lot better because a lot of the songs that I have that are either in the can or I've redone were songs that I wrote during that time in Houston. And I think maybe it's fortunate that I didn't do anything with those songs because now you look at the environment and there's there's a lot of good rock bands and rock music that I feel like it's starting to come full circle now. You're getting a lot more, bands like Pretty Reckless out there and, others that have, melodic hard rock, Lizzie Hale and Hailstorm. And, there's just a bunch of bands out there that are creating what I would consider to be guitar driven rock.
And I think that obviously, having younger bands with younger appeal goes a long way because, the guys like you and me are going to be like, oh, hey, I don't know what this new rock song is, but I enjoy it. But when you're surrounded with media in a way that doesn't necessarily favor rock in any way, when you have like, some of the bands you're talking about, but when you have like a Dirty Honey or Greta Van Fleet, and I mean, Greta Van Fleet will play like arenas and sure, you can say like, boy, they sound a lot like Led Zeppelin, but it's like, yeah, but Led Zeppelin were incredibly successful. They're an influence. I think they sound a little bit less like Led Zeppelin than on their first record. I saw them open for Metallica. I thought they were great. It's, and some of those bands, I think, look, somebody's going to have to be buying tickets and I was going to say buying albums, but maybe downloading songs and CDs like 20 years from now. And you have to, it's at some point, Zach, the Rolling Stones aren't going to be able to tour anymore. It's not this year because I'm going to see them this July, but at some point they're going to have to stop.
Exactly. Yeah. The thing about good music is it boils down to the songwriting. And that's why you still hear Boston Zeppelin and everybody like that on the radio. And if you write good songs and, you're writing from within, but you're also taking into account that if you want to be in the music business, you have to have other people that relate to your song. I think that's important too. Just a good case in point is that one of the biggest bands in the world now and still has been the Foo Fighters. I mean, they're amazing. Thank you, Nirvana, for giving us Dave Grohl. I mean, just an incredible band and incredible songwriter and storyteller. And those songs will transcend generations.
Yeah, and and obviously he's great as sort of like a spokesperson for rock because of like
Yes.
how like in he is, on like hard
Yep.
rock, heavy metal, like, there's if Dave Grohl's saying like, hey, why is Ronnie James Dio not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Somebody's like, oh, well, if he's saying it, and Tom Morello's saying it,
Yep.
maybe there's something to this idea, and it's great when those people who sort of are in the cool kids club are like, yeah, but why is this club like not as big as maybe it should be?
As it should be.
But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, the Foo Fighters are a perfect example. You can't say that, look, Gene Simmons says a lot of things to make headlines and get clicks. Like, I know what his business is, but he's
Yeah. Yeah.
multiple
Totally.
times he's said rock is dead. And I'm like, all right, but
No.
I mean, I went and saw Kiss in November, and the show sold out at the Hollywood Bowl. So I know what he is trying to say, but I also know he's like amping it up. But it's like, Foo Fighters do a big tour, and look, it's not my cup of tea, but every year there's a lot of people on my Facebook feed that they go and see Dave Matthews every year. And look, it's like
Hey, more
there's a
power to
lot of
him, man.
live music. What's that?
Yeah. More power to Dave, man.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
what I'm saying. And it's like,
he's still doing it.
I got friends who are into jam bands like Fish, and people who
Sure.
like all kinds of things. And I'm like, great, yeah, go and see live music. So yeah, I think that that's the point, is that rock's not dead. And it's kind of like, it's a little bit, so you have to seek it out, and then you're going to find it. Before,
You
it's like,
do.
let me put on MTV, and you're like, oh, here's a hip hop video, here's a pop video, oh, here's a heavy metal video. Okay. And when you had that sort of laziness, but now even if you put on like
I do that.
Spotify, or you put
Yep.
on a channel on satellite radio, you're already like, well, I'm going to listen to the niche that I already like. So you have to be in that frame of mind, and I
100%.
guess it makes it a little harder, Zach, but at the same time, I guess the upside to now is, if look, you used to be able to sign up to be on a mailing list, and maybe you got something in the mail for signing up for
Yeah,
it.
right.
But now it's like I get emails from bands that I like bought tickets to a show like 10 years ago. And there's other ways to find out what's going on, but it's great to have that as an option directly, which you didn't have in sort of the era we're talking about in the late 90s, even the early 2000s. It wasn't as easy to like, well, I'm going to tell all the people who already like me when I'll be
Yep.
in their town, instead of like, well, there isn't, I don't know. I mean, I grew up in the New York
No way.
area, and there's not a good, there's like one classic rock station in New York. There's no current rock stations. I'm going to be honest. The classic rock station in New York is not great, and it doesn't play new music.
Sounds like Memphis. Yeah, we've got
Oh, Memphis is like that. Yeah.
yeah, in Memphis. We have a couple of old classic rock stations. One's playing a little bit newer stuff, but if you want cutting edge rock, you're not going to get it here unless you go, to XM or something like that.
Right. Yeah. And that's really where you have to go. And, I do have the satellite radio, so I'll find stuff, but, there's sort of like specific personalities, that,
Yes.
like you're like, oh, I like, Eddie Trunk, who's done rock based radio for like 40 years now. It's like,
Yes.
okay, I listen to his show. Oh, he's going to have on somebody from a band I've never heard of, but I have to be a fan of the host, and then trust him, which I trust him to give a listen to a band that sounds interesting,
Yeah.
and it's not that easy. Not everybody is like, oh, I want to listen to a show where they talk about rock music for 2 hours every day. Not everybody wants to do that, Zach.
Yeah.
I hope people are listening to me right now, but
People
I
listen to.
realize that, it's not, it's not the old model. And you can get out there and, look, our audio audience is going to hear a nice chunk of your song Black, which we'll talk about in a minute. But
Cool.
how are you finding, I think the last time we talked to you was early 2021. So you're talking about putting out that EP, working on it during the pandemic.
Mhm.
How have you found sort of like the last few years to be? I think it was about 3 years ago that I talked to you. How do you feel it's gone sort of in that time, getting the EP out there and making people know that it's there?
Um, it's weird, maybe is a good word for it. The immediate aftermath of the pandemic, there was still a lot of delay in doing live shows and things like that. And a lot of bands were not touring. And then all of a sudden there's a glut of content, and, you're having to fight to get your content out there. above the fray. And let's face it, I do feel like that back in the day, the labels, obviously controlled the market to a certain degree, and you weren't going to go anywhere unless you had major label support. These days, anybody can be quote unquote an artist, but let's face it, 98% of those artists are probably not that great, and they're in their bedroom with Pro Tools and trying to figure things out, which is great for creativity. But then, in terms of getting people to notice your music and getting out there, you have to learn to be your own label and have the tools and the skill set to be able to do that. Or you still have to have somebody like a label or a promotion company or label services company to help you. It's still possible to do it. I mean, between the time that you and I talk to each other, my Facebook fan base has grown to about 200,000, which I think's crazy.
Yeah, that's great.
But it's been a lot of hard work and dedication to make that happen. And, I think that unless you're an artist that you're lucky in the right place at the right time, that it's extremely hard to get above the fray, and get traction. Now, all that said is I'm not a young kid and I'm not on TikTok and all that other crap, and I have no desire to do TikToks whatsoever. And I will continue.
Yeah, just let me jump in for a second, Zach.
Yeah.
When somebody that I know, either professionally or just a friend, like asks if I follow them on TikTok, and I'm like, what? What are you doing on TikTok? Let alone what I'm doing on there. I'm like,
Right.
I'm like, no. And I do understand it can be a great promotion, but it's almost like, how like when Facebook started, you needed to be in college, you needed to have an email address that was .edu to sign up for Facebook.
Yep.
There needs to be some kind of like quiz to sign up for TikTok. If you have too much knowledge of the world before the year like 2010, you shouldn't be on TikTok.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I 100% agree with that. But hey, look, God bless them. I mean,
it's
still
great.
When I hear things like TikTok star or YouTube star, I just want to go, oh my God, you got to be kidding me. But it's a thing.
Yeah. No, when kids will be like, what do you want to do when you grow up? Oh, I want to be a YouTube star. And I'm like, I mean,
what?
There's that guy, Mr. Beast, who, literally makes millions. And then
millions.
there's like this kid who like basically started his own toy line because his unboxing of toy videos, and you hear about all of it. And I'm like, yeah, but I mean, look, I'm on YouTube. It's not like just putting up a YouTube channel immediately has those results. Somebody has to find it. Somebody has to help you. And in terms of music, I mentioned Dirty Honey a little while ago. They still don't have a record label, but they do have a support staff. They have a team with them that I think helps it. At this point, I don't see why they would add a record label to that, because I think that they're having enough success. But obviously there are those, you used to have like the A&R department at a record label. You had the people who set up, phone interviews for the city you're coming to in like 2 days, and all that. And it's just like, yes, you can do it all yourself, but as your website points out, you're a musician / entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur part takes up part of the day, so I can see how it's definitely an uphill climb. And, you're talking about how anybody can just get Pro Tools, and you think about some of the success stories, and again, not my kind of music, but it's fascinating to think about the story of Billie Eilish and her brother, like literally in their bedroom making music. And then she's like, she had a song in the Barbie movie. She did a Bond song. So she goes from sitting with her brother playing around on a laptop to being like the next Shirley Bassey and doing like a big James Bond song. And the fact that you can do that is great for people with the ability. I think she's very talented for the genre that she's in. Again, not my thing, but you can respect it, totally. My wife loves Taylor Swift. God bless her. It's not my thing, but although, what I will say about Taylor Swift is that she like plays live and apparently by all indications doesn't lip sync, which especially in that genre is, so it's like, we might've spent a lot of money for my wife and her friends to go see Taylor Swift at the football stadium here in LA, but at least they saw a live show,
Look, Yeah, I respect her. I mean, she's guided her entire career, and
Yeah.
and she's, I mean, amazing. There's,
Yeah.
and again, it's not necessarily my cup of tea, but they're good songs, and she writes, predominantly, I think, most of her songs, and probably has some help. But considering when she started out, the type of songs she was writing, and the fact that they were as deep as they were, I mean, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, no, when somebody's able to sort of, make a career, like a good example from the 70s would be David Cassidy. And Donny
Absolutely.
Osmond's another good example, because
Yeah.
I remember Donny Osmond in the late 90s, he had a song come out called Soldier of Love, but they put it out as a mystery record and they wouldn't tell you who it was, and they would play it. And the song was pretty catchy. It was to some degree, maybe it wasn't a top 40 hit, it was a top 100. And it's like, yeah, sometimes you can evolve as a songwriter, but then people still see you a certain way,
Sure.
obviously making the transition from music to acting. I think we finally, somewhere in the last decade or so, got to the point where with Mark Wahlberg, we don't think about the Funky Bunch and,
Marky
and
Mark.
him like rapping. We don't think about Marky Mark first. I might think about it second, but I'm still going to think about the boxing movie that he did, The Fighter. I'm going to think about Boogie Nights.
Sure.
I'm going to think about other things first.
Looking at
It can be very, it can be very hard to make that evolution,
Yes, exactly.
and it's kind of, it's always impressive to sort of see that. But sort of all the trials and tribulations that you and I are talking about, Zach, it's why, like, I don't know, I think Aerosmith hasn't put out a new album in like 12 years. And,
Been a
Kiss said
while.
that they don't make new music anymore. You have bands who just are like, what's the point in putting out new music? Nobody's going to buy it. Nobody's going to listen to it. And, if we play a song from it, that's when everybody, runs to the bathroom or the beer line. But then you also have a band like Cheap Trick, who I think every single year puts out a new album. And they're like, well, we hope you like the new album because we're playing 4 songs from it. And I understand the artists who are like, why am I wasting my time making new music? But also there's the approach of like, you're gonna love this song. Don't worry, we'll play it enough times. You come and see us often enough, then you'll be like, oh, maybe I'll get that album. And I don't know. It's obviously so difficult to navigate, and I'm just somebody who listens to music, as I mentioned. So you, as a musician, Zach, I can imagine that it's fairly tricky.
Yeah, I mean, new music to me. I mean, and again, we did the tour. Not my band, but my other company did the tour with Matchbox 20 this past summer, and they had a lot of new music. They went blended into their, the songs that they have to play every night, and it's great music. And by the time I got to the end of the tour, I'm like, wow, I want to hear that song again. I mean,
Yeah.
it's good music. So, um, I appreciate that, and also appreciate that these older guys still have the creative spark. They want to write music and they want to keep being creative. And I think that's what keeps us young at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think if you don't, and I don't mean you personally, if a musician doesn't want to make new music anymore, then they shouldn't. But, if it's like, if you don't have the fire, you know what? Don't. It's fine. You don't have to. Like, we were talking about Billy Joel before. He hasn't done any new music in like almost 30 years at this point. I think River Dreams was his last new album. He just goes out, he plays the hits, he has fun. That's fine. If you don't have it in you, yeah, don't. There are people who maybe should have stopped putting out new music 30 years ago. So, it goes both ways. But
Yeah.
a band like Cheap Trick, who still likes to put out music, even, bands like Night Ranger, they're like, well, we're going to record new music. We're going to play some of it. We hope people like it. And the only band who can really get away with it is like Iron Maiden's like, we have a new album out. We're going to mostly play the new album. You get a couple of hits, but we're letting you know, you're not going to hear all the hits. So listen to the new album. We're excited to play it. And I like that. Look, if a band is excited to play new music, then you at least respect the time that maybe they left a song behind. I mean,
100%.
And I appreciate that as just a music fan and as a concert goer. So let's talk. It's a long meandering way to get to the point of me asking you about your new song Black. And I believe that's the current song, because that's the one I listened to a lot before getting on this call with you. Talk a little bit about that song and kind of the reaction you've had to it and the time it's been out.
Sure. So Black is another one of those songs that I had in the can for a while. I wrote it in the late 90s or maybe even the early 2000s. The song is actually was inspired by events that happened in Dallas while I was living in there at the time. there was a woman by the name of Darlie Lynn Routier who had initially accused a burglar of coming in and stabbing her 2 kids to death and cutting her up. And it turns out at the end of the day, she did it. So she's sitting on death row, and it was a big ordeal in Dallas at the time. And this song was actually written about that specific incident, and it's definitely a deviation of my other songs. Most of my other songs are fairly upbeat and positive in spirit. This is definitely not one of those songs. It's heavier than a lot of my other music, and so far this song has really gotten a lot of pickup. I've got a lot of stations playing it right now, a lot of positive responses. So I'm pretty thrilled that it's doing what it's doing.
Yeah, it's first of all, the story you're referencing is not one I was familiar with, but it's terrible, and it is reminiscent of a story that I think people remember from going back 30 some odd years. There's that woman Susan Smith who said someone stole her car and her kids were in it, but she drove it into a lake and tragically killed her kids. And there's often that you have the guy who, look, for legal reasons, I know they made a movie about him, but I won't say it. The guy that was blamed for bombing the Olympics in Georgia in 1996, who it turns out did not have anything to do with it, but because they said his name, he's forever linked to that. And, it's like, obviously history is filled with things like that. You go back to the Lindbergh baby, the guy who was hanged for it or electrocuted for it probably didn't do it, but they need somebody that did it. And, it's interesting. Yeah, right. There's that thought too, but he was like, nobody would have ever, it's like no one even thought in those days to look towards like, the actual person. Yeah. Yes. I know I'm sure a police detective will tell you that the first person to be suspicious of is the person who picks up the phone and calls the police. It's like, why are you calling the police? But and so, I can see what you mean, that the subject matter, not knowing that background, I was listening to the song, and you're right. It is a fairly, heavy song. It's very catchy. I had no idea you had written it in an earlier era. And look, I'm gonna be 48 in a month. So when I hear songs and it takes me back to an earlier era, I'm more likely to like it. So I was enjoying it, and I'm like, okay, I kind of get it now.
Cool. Well, yeah, it's one of the ones that I put on the EP. So thankfully, I waited till I got a good producer, Sked Mills, to help me really turn a good song into a great song. So I think timing's everything at the end of the day too.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, there's definitely a song comes out at a point, and established bands will do this. You'll sort of like, well, let's remix that song and put it out again and see what happens. Let's put out, you bringing it back to Kiss, as I so often do, like one of their most popular singles was the live version of Rock and Roll All Night, because their first few albums people didn't really buy and didn't resound with people. But it's like, but the live version, like that's the thing that you tend to hear. Speaking of Cheap Trick, I Want You to Want Me. It's a fine song, the studio version, but that version from Budokan is the one everybody thinks about, where Robin's like, I want you to want me. And if the song ever starts without that part, I'm like, what are you doing? I need that. So a lot of times, sometimes it's not even like you need to put a new coat of paint on something. Sometimes you're like, I'm going to put the right coat of paint on it, and I'm going to put it out at a time. And that's when, look, we go back almost 30 years at this point. There was the point where everybody was doing an MTV Unplugged and putting out an album, and it didn't make me dislike the rock versions, but I'm like, oh, this is really cool to hear this song in this way,
different.
I think the first time people heard that acoustic Layla by Eric Clapton, I still much prefer the Electric Derek and the Dominoes version. I just remember the first time I heard it, I'm like, oh my God, like he took that song and he did this to it. So it's all about figuring out what speaks to people at a time that it can get out there. And so for your song Black, I'm glad to hear that it's getting played. If people want to find you and find the song, where do they go to keep tabs on Zach Bair?
Sure. So the website is zachbairmusic.com. It's at ZACHBAIR music.com. And then Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube are all Zach Bair Official, ZACHBAIR Official. And then I'm on Spotify and Apple Music and about 30 other digital platforms where I'll make 10 cents the next year. So
Yeah.
feel free to stream
So
that.
that part's bad where you'll get a check in 2025 and you're like, oh my God, I made 18 cents. But
Exactly.
the good part is the way that you talked about it. It's like, yeah. So if somebody hears the audio version of this where they hear the music or they're watching us on YouTube, they're like, all they got to do, if you're on YouTube right now, you click right there and you type in Zach Bair and you're going to go to your YouTube page. So that's the way that's a little bit better about modern technology, I would think. That it's like I'm going to add him to my playlist, not like, all right, I have to write this down, and the next time that I take at least for me, the 20-minute drive to where I can buy CDs, I'll see if they have it in stock, make sure I spelled the name right, and now it's just like, oh yeah, that's on my phone, like I could add it to my phone right now, Zach. I could have everything on there, which I think is great. And how does 2024 look in terms of other new music, any performing that you've got planned, or is it all, we're still very early in 2024, so I realize it could be a wait.
Yeah, we're hoping to get out and do some shows, in late spring and early summer. And I'm working on a couple of new pieces of music. So there's probably going to be a single coming out in the next 6 months as well.
Well, that sounds great. Zach, it's wonderful to get a chance to talk to you again.
You as well.
ZACHBAIR music.com. There's multiple ways to spell Zach. People might try and put an L in your name, but it's Zach Bair and not Grizzly Bear. So I just want to make sure that everything gets spelled correctly for my audience, because my audience is smarter than me. But if I were listening, I would need that spelled out. Zach, our audio audience is going to hear a little bit of black right now, and our YouTube audience, like I said, you can find Zach with a click of the button. But thanks so much for your time, Zach Bair. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, man. I sure appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely.